They said there wouldn't be space for me, but they weren't talking about the parking lot. The group chat pinged in the middle of the afternoon, just as I was finishing up paperwork for a shipment they'd forgotten to confirm. "Parking is tight. Please park far away," the message read. My name wasn't tagged, but I didn't need it to be. I knew who that was for. The rest of them had reserved valet spots by name. I read it twice, the words settling in my chest like a weight I'd carried before. The kind that doesn't crush you in a moment, but grinds down over years. Useful hands, unwanted presence, that was my role now. That. My first instinct was the polite one. I typed, "Got it," ready to send. That old habit of making things easier for everyone else, even when it made things harder for me, almost won. But my finger hovered over the send button, then moved away. I deleted it. Some doors don't slam, they just close quietly in your face, and you're expected to smile at the wood. I sat there, phone still in my hand, thinking about all the roads I'd paved for them. Not metaphorical roads, real ones. The contracts I'd signed in my name so they could build their dream without risking theirs. The times I parked far away in more ways than one, standing at the edges of their celebrations, applauding from the shadows because they told me it would be better for appearances. Maybe they thought this was just another one of those times, that I'd park my old truck 3 streets down, straighten my tie in the side mirror, and walk in smiling like I didn't notice the distance they were putting between us. But they forgot something. I built more than their business. I built contingencies, and I wasn't about to make this walk for them again. I leaned back in my chair, the faint hum of the heater filling the silence, and opened a different app, a number I hadn't called in years, a service I'd kept on retainer out of pure instinct, like keeping a fire extinguisher in a house you hope never burns. The line picked up. "I need a car," I said, "black tinted, tonight." The voice on the other end didn't ask why. They didn't need to. Some things don't require explanation. And as I hung up, I realized this wasn't about parking anymore. This was about the space they thought I no longer deserved. And I was about to take it back without saying a word. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. In the past, I would have taken the hint without protest. I would have parked 3, maybe 4 blocks away, locking my old truck in some dim side street, jacket folded neatly over my arm, walking briskly through the cold evening air, as if the distance didn't matter. I would have told myself it was fine, that they were just being practical, that it wasn't personal. I'd have smiled when I arrived, even if my shoes were wet from the puddles, and my breath showed in white clouds. I would have made it easy for them to forget how far they'd asked me to stand. But tonight was different. Something in that message cut deeper than usual. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way the words were so casual, as if the decision to keep me at a distance had been made long before the excuse was written. Or maybe it was because I was finally tired of playing along with their quiet exclusions. I thought about every year I'd done the long walk. Every time I stood outside their bright venues, dusting off my sleeves, before stepping in, trying to blend into their world without making waves. And I thought about how none of those nights had changed a thing. No matter how far away I parked, I was still kept at arm's length once I got inside. Distance wasn't about the parking lot. It was about the space they'd carved between me and the life I helped build. So I didn't even reach for my truck keys this time. Instead, I opened my phone and scrolled past the usual contacts until I found the one I'd never expected to use. Years ago, when the company was still in its fragile infancy, I'd set up a quiet contingency under our corporate name, a standing arrangement with a private car service that had been intended for clients or emergencies. I'd never once used it for myself, but I'd kept it, out of habit, out of instinct. Tonight it became my way of shortening the longest walk I'd ever taken. The booking was simple, black-tinted limousine, no logos, no unnecessary formality, under the company alias. Within minutes the confirmation arrived, and with it an unfamiliar calm settled over me. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge. It was the quiet knowledge that I didn't have to accept their conditions anymore. I stepped to the window and watched the evening settle over the city. Lights flickered on in the distance, cold wind pushing leaves across the pavement. In the reflection, I saw the same face that had been told, in 100 polite ways, to stay in the background. But tonight, the background was over. If they wanted me to park far away, they would have to watch as dignity arrived at the front door, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. The city slid past the tinted glass in slow, deliberate frames, each streetlight spilling brief gold over the leather interior before vanishing into shadow. Outside, people hurried through the cold, bundled against the wind, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place inside this car. I leaned back, hands resting loosely on my knees, and let my mind wander to the years that had brought me here. I remembered the early mornings that belonged to me alone, the ones before anyone else was awake, when the air was still heavy with the smell of coffee and rain. Those were the hours I built foundations no one saw. I drafted proposals by hand because the printer was broken, drove across the city to hand-deliver contracts because the courier had failed, and signed guarantees in my own name so they could have the security to dream. When the business was new and fragile, they didn't mind my presence. Back then, I wasn't an inconvenience. I was essential. My loans kept the lights on, my advice kept the wrong deals from being signed, my quiet interventions kept their mistakes from becoming public disasters. But as the years went on, my value became something they used rather than acknowledged. My name disappeared from the official paperwork, not because it wasn't earned, but because it wasn't the right image. They said it gently as if that softened the cut. It didn't. Betrayal, I've learned, is rarely a sharp knife. It's a steady erosion. It comes dressed in compliments and just for now compromises, until one day you realize the space you once occupied has been filled by people who smile at you while moving your chair further away from the table. They liked my help more than they liked me. That was the truth I had ignored for too long. The limousine hummed steadily along, a silent witness to the shift inside me. This was not a ride of vanity. This was not about making an entrance to shock them. This was about reclaiming something they had been slowly taking without permission, the right to stand where I belonged. I thought about the look on their faces when they realized who had stepped out of the car. It wasn't anticipation that filled me. It was a kind of quiet justice, the sort that doesn't demand an apology because it doesn't need one to prove its point. Outside, the skyline loomed closer. Somewhere in that bright facade was the building where they would gather, glasses raised, stories told, history rewritten without my name in it. But tonight, the man they'd written out was coming to stand in the center of their carefully arranged picture, whether they had space for him or not. The limo glided off the main road and onto the long, winding driveway that led to the venue, a stretch of polished asphalt flanked by glass walls and manicured hedges. It was the kind of entrance designed to impress, to make everyone arriving feel like they were stepping into a world where appearances mattered more than substance. Tonight, that suited me just fine. The headlights swept across the row of valets standing at attention, their matching uniforms crisp under the glow of the entrance lights. For a moment they didn't react, the tinted silhouette of the car keeping its passenger hidden. Then I saw it, the subtle shift in posture, the way pens stilled in mid-signature, the way heads turned. A black-tinted limousine wasn't common here. It was a symbol, one that carried weight before anyone even knew whose name it bore. Cameras clicked in the distance, the familiar pop and flash reserved for the favored guests they knew by sight. But my door stayed closed. The chauffeur eased the car to a slow stop, the engine a soft, steady hum. Behind the glass, I sat still, letting the seconds stretch. Not to build suspense, but to let the moment breathe, to feel the air of a place I'd been kept from for so long. I looked through the reflection in the window and saw my own eyes staring back at me. They were older, yes, but steadier too. There was no anger there, no heat of wanting to prove something, just the quiet knowledge that I didn't need to rush out and announce myself. If they couldn't see me yet, they could at least see the dignity of a man who arrived on his own terms, without lowering himself to fit the comfort of others. Outside, a valet stepped forward hesitantly, clipboard pressed to his side, his gaze flicking between the chauffeur and the closed door. He was waiting for a sign, a gesture, a hint of who might emerge. I offered none. I simply breathed in, slow and steady, feeling the weight of the years pressing against this moment. In the polished glass of the entrance ahead, the whole scene reflected back. The black car, the scattering attendants, the curious faces turning toward the unknown arrival. It was a driveway of mirrors, each surface showing a version of this arrival they couldn't quite name, and that was the beauty of it. I had been invisible to them for years, but invisibility in the right light can become a shield. If they could not yet see my face, then let them see this: humility that refused to crawl, presence that required no announcement, and the simple truth that sometimes the most powerful arrival is the one they don't expect, until the door finally opens. The chauffeur stepped around to open my door, and the crisp air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of winter and expensive cologne drifting from the entrance. I stepped out slowly, the polished black shoes meeting the smooth stone beneath me with a quiet certainty. For a moment, there was movement all around, coats being adjusted, greetings being exchanged, cameras shifting focus. But none of it was for me. The familiar faces were there, just as I knew they would be. Men and women I'd worked beside in boardrooms when the stakes were nothing but risk and hope. People whose early paychecks came from my own pocket, though they'd long forgotten the weight of that fact. They glanced my way, eyes flicking over me like I was a shadow on the wall, then moving past toward the people whose names were currently fashionable to know. Recognition didn't come, or perhaps it did, and was quickly brushed aside, replaced by the ease of ignoring. At the door, the host, a young man in an immaculate suit, clipboard clutched like a shield, gave me a polite but measured look. His smile was professional, the kind reserved for guests who might be important but whose names weren't on the mental list of faces worth fussing over. "Which party are you with?" he asked, pen poised. I could have said the company name. I could have listed half a dozen people in that building who owed their positions to me. Instead, I let the corner of my mouth lift, not in arrogance, but in the kind of quiet amusement that only comes from knowing a truth no one else here seems to see. "The one that pays the invoices on time," I said. He laughed, a small, unguarded sound, thinking it was a joke. His eyes flicked back to his list, still searching for something familiar to attach me to. He didn't realize I was giving him the most accurate introduction possible. Most people don't until the record is printed and framed, until it's hanging on a wall they pass every day without looking closely enough. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the venue met me like a wall, filled with the hum of voices and the clink of glasses. The light was soft and golden, designed to flatter, to make everyone inside look like they belonged. But belonging here was an illusion, one I had once believed in, until I learned how quickly faces forget the ones who stood behind them when the foundation was still being poured. They didn't see me as someone worth greeting tonight. That was fine. The night was long, and introductions, real introductions, have a way of making themselves whether they're invited or not. And before this evening was over, every face that skimmed past me at the door would remember exactly who I was and why I had never needed a surname worth greeting. Inside, the glow of the chandeliers spilled across the room like liquid gold, catching the gleam of polished cutlery and the deep sheen of mahogany tables. Every seat had been dressed with care, crisp linens folded like origami, name cards written in calligraphy that spoke of forethought and hierarchy. And in that instant, I saw the pattern. The center tables, the ones bathed in the best light closest to the stage, bore the names of those who were always expected to be seen. Those seats were more than furniture, they were statements, each one a small throne in a kingdom built on perception. And then there was mine, tucked into a corner where the light dimmed into shadow, so close to the wall I could feel the cold draft through the paneling. The chair was angled awkwardly, as though it had been slid into place at the last minute, an afterthought rather than an invitation. The name card in front of it was printed correctly, but the ink seemed almost faded compared to the bold strokes at the center tables. If a seat could apologize for existing, this one did. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Years ago, this would have embarrassed me. I might have hesitated, smiled away the sting, and told myself that a seat was a seat. But tonight I didn't feel small. I didn't feel excluded in the way they hoped I would. Instead, I felt still, as though I was meant to see this clearly, to take in the architecture of their choices without rushing to challenge them. So I sat, slowly, deliberately. Not out of meekness, but out of witness. There is a power in sitting where they place you and letting the room reveal itself in its own unguarded moments. From my vantage point, I could see almost everything. The subtle nods exchanged between the prime tables, the way servers lingered longer where the light was bright, the way conversations ebbed and swelled like tides around certain names. I noticed, too, the people who glanced toward my corner and quickly looked away, as if eye contact might confirm some truth they preferred not to acknowledge. They weren't being cruel in the obvious way. No one had told me outright that I didn't belong. But this careful seating, this soft shadow, was the unspoken language of exclusion. I leaned back, hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, and let the evening unfold without interference. If they believed that distance would make me invisible, they had forgotten something important. When you've built the structure, you know how every beam fits together. You know which walls hold the weight. And from the corner, you can see the cracks forming long before those at the center notice the room is shifting. Tonight I would not demand a better seat. I would let the room tell on itself before I said a single word. The first chime of a glass cut through the murmur of the room, and conversations fell into a polite hush. The lights dimmed just enough to draw attention to the stage, where the first of the evening's speakers took the microphone. A server drifted by my table, setting down a fresh flute of champagne I didn't touch. I knew what was coming. I'd heard it all before, though never quite in the same polished form they would deliver tonight. They began with gratitude. That's how it always starts. A warm blanket of thanks wrapped around the people whose presence carries weight in a room like this. Our earliest supporters, the speaker said, smiling toward the center tables, the ones who believed in us before anyone else did. Nods of recognition passed between the chosen names. The golden ones whose belief, conveniently, began only after the first contracts were signed, and the risk had already been taken by someone else. I sat still, my face unreadable, as the list rolled on. They spoke of mentors who had guided them in difficult decisions, of quiet investors who trusted them when the numbers didn't yet make sense, of friends who had lent not just money, but faith. My chest tightened with each one, not because I envied the applause, I'd long since stopped expecting it, but because of the careful precision of the omission. They weren't stumbling over my absence. They had built the speech around it the way an architect leaves space in a wall for a hidden door. I thought back to the day I signed the mortgage papers, my own name anchoring a loan big enough to crush me if it went wrong. They'd been in my kitchen that night, their laughter nervous and brittle, the reality of what I'd done for them not yet fully sinking in. They didn't know I'd stayed awake until dawn running the numbers over and over, wondering if I'd just traded my future for their chance. They never knew how close I came to saying no. And now, years later, here we were. The story rewritten so neatly you could almost believe it had always been this way. Almost. But I kept my own ledger, one no speech could erase. It wasn't written in ink or stored in a file. It lived in memory, in the moments when the truth was sharp enough to slice through even the most flattering fabrications. This was the arithmetic of erasure. You take the facts, subtract the names that make you uncomfortable, add enough sentiment to distract from the gaps, and you arrive at the perfect sum, nothing with my name on it. And yet, as I watched them smiling beneath the soft glow of the stage lights, I realized something they hadn't accounted for. I was still here. Sitting in the shadows didn't mean I was gone. And the quiet ledger I carried wasn't for revenge. It was for truth. Because no matter how carefully they curated their origin story, the real numbers always balance eventually. From my corner, I could see the tables farthest from me more clearly than they could see me. That's how it is in shadows. You learn to watch without being watched. My gaze wandered over the room until it found him. My grandson. He sat at a table near the front, the light pooling on his hair like a small crown, his posture uncertain in a jacket that didn't quite fit his frame. He wasn't fidgeting like the other children I'd spotted earlier. He was looking, searching. Then his eyes met mine. For a second, the rest of the room disappeared. There was no clinking of glasses, no drone of speeches, no soft shuffle of servers' shoes on the polished floor. Just that boy, my boy's boy, seeing me. A slow smile began to form on his face, his hand lifting instinctively into a small, shy wave, the kind a child gives to someone they know is safe. My chest warmed at the sight. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried more weight than anything that had been said into a microphone all evening. But before his wave could fully take shape, a shoulder leaned toward him. A whisper, quick and low, reached his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw the hesitation ripple through him. His smile faltered. His hand lowered to his lap as though it had been caught doing something wrong. His gaze shifted back toward his plate, and the connection we'd shared dissolved into the hum of the room. It landed in me like a pebble dropped in water. Small, almost nothing at first, but sending out rings that kept expanding, touching places far from the point of impact. I've lived long enough to know that children learn quickly, not from the rules we recite, but from the behavior we reward and the truths we model. And tonight, they were teaching him something I'd spent a lifetime hoping he wouldn't have to learn. That distance can be disguised as decorum, that ignoring someone can be dressed up as grace, and that gratitude is optional when history is inconvenient. He wasn't being cruel, he was being careful, and that was worse. Because carefulness like that doesn't come from the heart. It comes from the quiet shaping of people who believe certain bonds are worth less than appearances. I sat back in my chair, not in defeat, but in recognition. I understood now that this night wasn't just about reclaiming my own place. It was about planting something in him that would outlast the whispers. I could not stop what he had been told in that moment, but I could make sure that before the evening was over, he would see something different. Something that told him the truth about where he came from, and what kind of man stood quietly in the corner, waiting for the right time to step forward. The call for the founders came with a flourish, as though the very word carried its own music. Applause rose, chairs shifted, and a line of well-dressed figures began making their way toward the stage. Their steps were confident, their smiles carefully timed to the rhythm of the clapping. They moved like they belonged there, because they did, in the version of the story they'd chosen to tell. I stayed seated. My name was not on the list, though my fingerprints were on every line of the company's first balance sheet. They knew that. I knew that. But recognition in rooms like this isn't about truth. It's about control. And I had no intention of walking up onto a stage built on their terms. In my jacket pocket, folded so neatly it could almost be mistaken for nothing, was the speech I had written years ago. It had been meant for a night like this, back when I still believed that one day they would want me to speak. It wasn't a boastful speech. It was about bridges, the kind we build between people, not places. About hands, the ones that lift others even when they're tired. About second chances, the kind we give without knowing if we'll ever see the return. I'd carried that speech like a quiet promise to myself. But tonight, as I pressed my fingers against the paper, I began folding it tighter, slower, until the crease grew sharp enough to feel like a blade against my skin. Some truths are not meant to be delivered into microphones. Some truths are meant to cut free the weight you've been carrying, even if it leaves a mark. On stage, the speeches began, all polished gratitude and selective memory. I watched their mouths move, forming words about risk and vision, about courage and teamwork. None of it was untrue. It was simply incomplete, like a photograph that had been cropped so the scaffolding didn't show. I wondered how many people in the room could sense what was missing, or if the absence of a thing is invisible once it's been erased well enough. My hand tightened around the folded paper until it was warm from my palm. I could feel the years in it, the long nights, the mortgages signed in faith, The phone calls taken in silence so no one would know how close we'd come to losing everything. All of that was in these creases, and all of it would stay here tonight. I didn't need the stage to say what I came to say. The real speech was in my presence, in my decision to remain seated while they called the names they could live with. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them speak without you, and watch as the story they tell fails to hold the weight of the truth it leaves behind. She approached like someone walking into a room where glass might break if she spoke too loudly. A young woman in a black blazer, clipboard hugged to her chest, her smile both professional and apologetic. She glanced at my table, the dim light, the edge of shadow creeping across the white linen, and then back at me, as if she could feel the wrongness of it, even if she didn't know the history behind it. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice lowered so it wouldn't carry over the music and the chatter. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the center of the room where the light was warmest, the tables more carefully arranged. "We could move you if you'd like. Maybe over here?" She gestured to a table still close to the wall, but at least within sight of the stage. "Anywhere but the center." I watched her for a moment, this well-meaning coordinator who had nothing to do with the decisions that had placed me here. She was doing what she thought was right, smoothing over an arrangement she sensed was wrong, but couldn't change entirely. Still, the offer carried the quiet truth. Some seats are given, others are allowed, and the one I had earned was neither. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for the folded speech that still sat like a blade, but for something smaller. A plain white card, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. I slid it across the table toward her, my hand steady, my gaze never leaving hers. She looked down. One line of text, that was all. A single sentence authorizing full payment for tonight's venue, every plate of food, every poured glass of wine, every hour of lighting and music, as well as the debt rollover for the next quarter's events. Signed with a name she recognized, though perhaps not one she expected to see in this corner. Her eyes widened, the clipboard lowering slightly as if its weight had just doubled. I could see the shift in her posture, the way her mind was recalibrating the image of the man seated here in the shadows. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing there was nothing she could say that would fit the moment. Quiet power does not raise its voice. It does not demand to be moved into the light or fight for space at the center. Quiet power writes the checks that make the lights possible in the first place. Quiet power pays the bill without asking for thanks. And sometimes, quiet power slides a card across a table, not to prove anything to the person receiving it, but to remind itself of a truth no one can erase. I am not here because they let me in. I am here because I built the door they walked through. She slipped the card into her folder with careful fingers, a nod passing between us that said she understood at least part of it. Then she walked away, leaving me in my shadowed seat, still not in the center, but suddenly holding the most solid ground in the room. It began like the faint rustle of leaves before a storm. Small voices shifting in tone, pockets of conversation breaking rhythm. A glance here, a subtle lean closer there. Someone at the far end of the room tilted their head toward the entrance and murmured something behind their hand. A laugh that wasn't quite a laugh followed, uncertain and caught halfway between surprise and disbelief. "Who arrived in the limo?" floated from one cluster of guests, quiet, but not quiet enough to disappear. Then from another side of the room, "Is that him?" The question wasn't aimed at me, but the weight of it curved through the air until it settled in my direction. Recognition moves slowly in rooms like this, not because people don't know the truth, but because they're deciding how much of it they're willing to admit aloud. I kept my posture still, my movements unhurried. A sip of water, the glass cool against my palm. My gaze steady on no one in particular, though I could feel the subtle shift in attention, the way the temperature of the air seemed to change with every new whisper. Names are strange things. When they need you, your name softens in their mouths, dressed in warmth and familiarity. When they don't, it hardens, becomes shorter, clipped, almost foreign, as if saying it too fully might give you a place you haven't been offered. Tonight I could hear the gradual softening, as though the memory of who I was, of what I had done, was seeping back into their calculations. It wasn't pride that held me still. Pride is restless. It wants to be fed, acknowledged, rewarded. What kept me still was dignity, and dignity knows the value of patience. Dignity can wait while others catch up to the truth it already knows. I thought about how easy it would be to break the tension, to stand, to walk across the room and let my presence fill the space until there was no doubt left. But there's a quiet satisfaction in watching the room recalibrate on its own, in seeing the mental lines redrawn without you lifting a hand. The whispers would grow into glances, the glances into nods, the nods into invitations. That was the nature of these gatherings. Power didn't move toward you until it remembered it needed you. And tonight, I would let them remember, slowly, uncomfortably, exactly who had stepped out of that black-tinted car. I noticed him before he noticed me. The legal representative, a man who had been around long enough to know where the bones of this company were buried. He was standing near the back of the room, a champagne flute untouched in his hand, his expression neutral until a flicker of recognition crossed it. Something, maybe the whispers, maybe the sight of me in that shadowed corner, had jogged a memory he'd clearly been living without for years. He made his way toward me, his steps slower than they needed to be, as if each one was weighed down by the thought he was carrying. By the time he reached my table, the faint color had drained from his face. He greeted me with a nod, not warm, not cold, but deliberate, the kind of gesture that said, "I remember, and I wish I didn't have to." I didn't speak first. I let the silence between us hold the truth until he felt its weight. His gaze shifted briefly to the stage, where another round of curated history was being spun into applause, then back to me. And I knew that he had remembered the clause. It had been signed years ago in an office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink. A tired Tuesday when everyone just wanted to get the documents finalized so the deal could close. Page after page of agreements, most of them boilerplate, a few of them specific to our arrangement. And there, buried deep in the footnotes of a section no one thought twice about, was a single line I had insisted on. Final discretion over any and all public acknowledgments tied to company funding remains with the undersigned, hereafter referred to as primary partner. At the time, they'd called it ceremonial, a nice symbolic nod to the man who had helped get them through the fragile years. I had signed it without ceremony, without explaining why it mattered, because I knew something they didn't. Ceremonies matter most when truth is shy. That clause meant that every official mention of the company's backers, supporters, and early believers had to pass through me before it could be sanctioned. It meant that tonight's speeches, the carefully curated lists that had skipped my name without hesitation, were in violation of their own binding agreement. I could see the realization in his eyes, the silent calculation of what this meant if I chose to act on it. The color that had drained from his face earlier was now replaced by a kind of restless urgency. He glanced toward the stage again, then toward the people at the center tables who were still laughing, unaware of the ground shifting beneath them. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. My silence was the reminder. He was the one who would have to speak to them, to explain the oversight, to scramble for a way to fix it before the night was over. And as he straightened, smoothing the front of his suit, I could see that the calm control of the evening was already starting to fray. Ceremonies, after all, are fragile things. They can be rewritten, rearranged, even revoked, especially when the man they thought was content to sit in the shadows still holds the pen. The lights dimmed further, and a hush fell over the room as the projector came to life. On the wide screen above the stage, the company's official history began to play. A sequence of carefully chosen photographs, polished video clips, and sentimental music swelling just enough to make the story feel inevitable. There were smiling faces breaking ground with golden shovels, ribbon-cutting ceremonies framed by balloons, late-night brainstorming sessions staged to look candid. Every moment had been selected to reinforce the narrative they wanted remembered. From my seat in the shadows, I watched it all, my expression unreadable. I had seen most of those moments firsthand, though from angles the camera had not cared to capture. angles that showed who was quietly holding the weight, while others posed for the lens. And then, just as the applause from one particularly triumphant scene began to stir, the reel stuttered. The music cut short, replaced by the soft click of a slide change. The image froze, then faded, and a new one appeared. It was not part of their plan. A scanned ledger filled the screen, its pages worn, the handwriting unmistakably mine. Dates, figures, notes in the margins. The financial lifeline I had extended in the company's most desperate hours, documented in the same ink that had signed away my own security. Page after page appeared, each stamped and dated, each telling the truth they had chosen to keep off the record. The photos returned, but they were no longer just smiling faces. Now, interspersed between them were images of signed contracts, personal checks, correspondence with my signature at the bottom, the scaffolding beneath the chandeliers, the beams holding up the walls in which they now stood so proudly. Gasps began to ripple through the room, at first small and scattered, but quickly growing as the realization spread. Conversations faltered. The laughter at the prime tables quieted into a brittle silence. Even those who had known part of the truth were now seeing its full weight projected larger than life, impossible to turn away from. I hadn't edited their story. I hadn't removed a single thing. I had simply completed it. I had filled in the empty spaces with what had always been there, invisible until now. The reel ended, the screen going dark, leaving only the low hum of the projector fan. No one moved for several seconds. The room felt different now. Not angry, not chaotic, but suspended in a rare stillness, as if everyone present was recalibrating what they thought they knew. From my seat, I sipped my water again, letting the moment breathe. I had not raised my voice. I had not demanded their attention. I had simply pulled the curtain back, and the truth, long shy, long hidden, had stepped into the light on its own. The silence after the reel lingered, heavy and unbroken, until movement rippled at the edges of the room. It was subtle at first, chairs shifting, servers pausing mid-step, heads turning toward me as if pulled by the same invisible thread. Then, almost without conscious decision, people began to part. A narrow path emerged between the tables, cutting through the pools of golden light that had seemed unreachable from my corner only moments ago. I rose without hurry. My steps were measured, steady, the sound of my shoes muted against the carpet, yet somehow louder than the chatter that had filled this place earlier. Eyes followed me, not with the polite acknowledgement they'd offered when I arrived, but with something weightier. Some looked with guilt, some with newfound respect, others with curiosity. It didn't matter which. I hadn't walked this far to collect apologies or approval. Halfway down the path, I saw him. My grandson. His eyes found mine again, but this time there was no hesitation, no quick glance toward a whispering shoulder. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. His gaze was steady, open, carrying the quiet pride of someone who had just learned something important about where they come from. And this time, no one told him to look away. I passed the center tables, the ones that had always been reserved for others. No one blocked my way. No one offered a token seat now because they knew, as surely as I did, that the seat I was heading toward was no longer theirs to give. It had been mine long before tonight. They had just kept it empty. When I reached it, I didn't pause to let the moment swell. I didn't make a show of claiming it. I simply pulled the chair back, felt the solid weight of it beneath my hands, and sat. The cushion wasn't softer. The frame wasn't finer. The gilded trim didn't matter. What mattered was the weight it carried now. Not the physical weight, but the years, the history, the truth that had finally been placed where it belonged. From here, the view was different. I could see the whole room without straining, the stage without shadows, the faces without distance. But more than that, I could feel the shift. This wasn't about me being in the light for its own sake. It was about balance being restored, about a place no longer left empty out of convenience. I folded my hands on the table, calm and unhurried, as the hum of the room began to return. Somewhere behind me the projector was still cooling, the truth still settling into the corners of people's minds. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct anyone's version of events. I didn't need to. The walk to the middle had already done what words never could. This seat fit not because it was gilded, but because tonight, finally, it carried the weight it owed. The night wound down in a way only nights heavy with unspoken truths can. Conversations became quieter, laughter thinner, as though each person was still turning over the images they'd seen on the screen, the connections they hadn't made before. The air felt different now. Not tense, but aware. Even the ones who had avoided my gaze earlier found themselves glancing toward me, some with small nods, others with a hesitation that spoke more than any apology could. When it was time to leave, I rose without ceremony. No announcements, no lingering at the table to be coaxed into staying. I walked the same path I had taken toward the center earlier, but this time it didn't open out of surprise. It opened out of understanding. Chairs eased back, bodies shifted, faces followed me. They knew where I was going. They knew what waited outside. The cold air met me like an old friend as I stepped through the doors, the sound of the city stretching beyond the glow of the entrance. The black-tinted limo was there, engine low and steady, waiting exactly where it had been when I arrived. It wasn't ostentation, it wasn't a statement, it was simply mine, a reminder that I could choose how I arrived and how I left. I slid into the back seat, the warmth inside wrapping around me. Before the chauffeur could pull away, I lowered the window. A few of them had followed me out, their silhouettes framed by the light spilling from the doorway. They stood there, unsure if this was a moment to speak or to simply watch. "Next time," I said, my voice calm but caring enough to reach them, "no one parks far." There was no edge in it, no bitterness, just a simple instruction disguised as a promise, or perhaps a warning. It was for all of them, but also for the boy who was now making his way toward me. My grandson, walking quickly, almost running, his face lit with something that hadn't been there earlier in the night. He didn't hesitate now. He climbed in beside me, the door closing softly behind him. His small hand found mine, fingers curling around with quiet certainty. He didn't speak, and neither did I. He didn't need to hear the story in words. He had seen it unfold. He had seen what truth looked like when it didn't fight for the loudest voice, when it simply stood its ground until the ground shifted on its own. As the car pulled away, the city lights passing in fractured patterns across the tinted glass, I thought about how justice is so often misunderstood. People expect it to roar, to storm in with noise and spectacle. But the truth is, justice doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it arrives on soft tires, opens a door and says nothing more than, "Get in." And that night he did.